In the summer of 2025, residents of a small farming community on the outskirts of Millbrook, Tennessee, witnessed something they could not explain. Just after sunrise, on a Tuesday morning, so still that birdsong carried half a mile, nearly 50 service trucks rolled down a dusty country road and turned onto a struggling farm that most of the county had quietly given up on. Neighbors stepped out onto front porches. Some pulled trucks to the edge of the road and just sat there, engine idling, watching. Children pressed faces against screen doors. An elderly woman named Carol Briggs, who had lived on the adjacent property for 40 years, said she thought it was a funeral procession at first. Then she counted the trucks. Then she saw the equipment. Some thought the bank had finally come to collect what was owed. Others whispered that a development company from Nashville had purchased the land overnight. A few just stood at the fence line with their arms crossed, shaking their heads slowly, the way people do when they already believe they know how a story ends. No one expected what actually happened next, because that farm belonged to Walter Greer, a man who had spent the better part of 6 decades pressing his boots into that same red Tennessee clay. A man whose father had worked that land, and whose grandfather before him had cleared the first trees from it, with nothing but a mule and a handsaw. Walter was 71 years old by the time those trucks arrived. His back had not straightened fully in years. His hands were thick and calloused, cracked at the knuckles, the kind of hands that told a story without a single word. He had buried a wife on that land. He had buried 2 dogs, a brother, and more seasons of hope than most people will ever dare to plant. What made the arrival of those 50 trucks so shocking was not just the size of the convoy, it was the timing. Because 31 years earlier, at the worst possible moment of his life, Walter Greer had made a decision that the entire county of Millbrook had called foolish. He had given away his last bull, not to a neighbor, not to the bank, not to save a debt or earn a favor. He had given it to a homeless 16-year-old boy that most people in town could not even name. People said Walter had lost his mind. His own brother had driven out to the farm and stood right there in the yard and said, "Walt, you cannot afford to be generous right now. You understand what I'm telling you? You cannot afford it." Walter had looked at his brother for a long moment. Then he looked out at the field. And then he had said, quietly and without drama, "I know what I can afford, Raymond, and I know what I can't live with." Raymond had driven away without another word. The bull was gone by the following morning. The boy disappeared not long after. And for 31 years, Walter Greer heard nothing. No letter. No phone call. No word passed through any neighbor or friend or distant relative. Just silence. The kind of silence that, in the deep hours of the night, can start to feel a lot like proof that the skeptics were right all along. But then those 50 trucks turned down his road, and everything that Walter Greer had been told about foolishness and kindness and the cost of compassion was about to be answered in a way that not one person in Millbrook had seen coming. To understand why those trucks came, you have to go back to the summer of 1994. You have to imagine Tennessee without rain, not a dry spell, not a rough patch. A drought so severe that the ground cracked in patterns that looked like broken pottery, and the creek that ran along the eastern edge of Walter's property shrank down to little more than a muddy trickle by the end of June. The summer of 1994 hit farming communities across the South like a slow emergency. Feed prices climbed. Livestock grew thin. The grain co-op in Millbrook posted a notice in July that rationing would begin in August. Walter stood in his barn one evening that summer and looked at what he had left. A tractor with a cracked housing. A rusted water pump that required a specific touch to start. 43 acres of stressed, thirsty corn. 3 cows. And 1 bull, The bull's name was Red, not because anyone had given him that name officially, but because he had this reddish cast to his coat in the afternoon light, and the name had simply stuck. Red was not just a bull. Red was collateral. Red was the reason any bank in Millbrook would still return Walter's call. Red was the reason there would be a next season at all. Without him, the Greer farm had nothing to breed, nothing to build from, nothing to sell forward. Walter knew this. His wife, Margaret, knew this. Margaret had sat at the kitchen table that August and gone through the numbers 3 times, and each time she arrived at the same answer. "Walt," she had said, setting down her pencil, "we're 60 days from making a very hard decision." "I know," he had told her. "I mean about the land," she said. "Not about the livestock. About the land?" He had not answered her. He had just refilled his coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard, the way men do when they are carrying something they refuse to put down. It was 3 days after that conversation that Walter found the boy. He was sitting behind the feed barn, not sleeping, not crying, just sitting. His knees pulled to his chest, a torn backpack beside him, boots that had clearly walked a very long way to get to wherever they'd landed. He looked up when Walter's shadow fell across him. He looked directly at Walter and did not flinch, which Walter would later say was the first thing that made him pay attention. "You hungry?" Walter asked. The boy hesitated. That hesitation told Walter more than any answer would have. "Come on then," Walter said, and walked toward the house. He did not look back to see if the boy followed, but when he opened the screen door and held it, the boy was right there behind him. His name was Marcus Webb. He was 16, though he looked closer to 14 from a distance, and he told Walter over a plate of eggs and toast that he had been on the road for 11 days since aging out of a foster care placement in Cookville that had not ended well. "What happened?" Walter asked. Marcus looked down at his plate. "The man there had a temper," he said. Walter did not push. He just refilled the boy's glass of water and said, "Eat." Margaret stood at the sink and did not say a word, but she caught Walter's eye once, and in that one look, passed a whole conversation between them that only 30 years of marriage could carry. She refilled Marcus's plate before he asked. Walter put Marcus to work the next morning, not because he needed cheap labor, because he had looked at this boy and seen something, the way Marcus had studied the cracked housing on the tractor without being asked, the way he had noticed, silently and without comment, that the water pump needed priming before he even touched it. "You worked on engines before?" Walter asked. "A little," Marcus said. "My foster dad before the last one. He fixed trucks. He let me help sometimes. You like it?" Marcus considered this with a seriousness that seemed older than his age. "I like when broken things work again," he said. Walter nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "I do too." For 3 weeks, Marcus worked alongside Walter from before dawn until the light gave out. He did not complain. He did not steal. He asked questions that were sharp and precise, and showed a mind that had not been given near enough space to grow. One evening, sitting on the porch, Walter asked him what he wanted to do with his life. Marcus stared out at the darkening field for a long time. "I want to build something that lasts," he said finally. "What kind of something?" "I don't know yet," Marcus admitted, "but something real. Something where, if I'm gone one day, people can still point to it and say, 'There, he was here.'" Walter was quiet for a moment. "That's not a small thing you're after," he said. "No, sir," Marcus agreed, "but I don't think I'm a small thing kind of person." Walter had laughed. It was the first time he had laughed in what felt like months. The crisis came at the end of August. A man from the county agricultural office had driven out and had a long conversation with Walter that ended with a number, a specific dollar figure, a deadline, and a very clear implication about what came after the deadline if that figure was not met. Walter walked back to the barn after the man drove away. He stood in front of Red's stall for a long time. Red watched him with those enormous, patient eyes. Marcus appeared in the barn doorway. "Who was that?" he asked. Walter told him. Marcus was quiet. Then he said, "How much?" Walter told him the number. Marcus did not look away. "You're going to lose the farm," he said. "Not if I sell what needs selling," Walter said. Marcus looked at Red, then back at Walter. "Not Red," he said. It was not a question. Walter did not answer. That night, Marcus came to the kitchen where Walter and Margaret were sitting. He set something on the table, a piece of paper. "I found a livestock buyer outside of Cookville. He's paying fair market for working bulls." Walter looked at the paper. He looked at Marcus. "You did that today?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" Marcus stood very still. "Because this farm is the first place that ever treated me like I was going to be something," he said. "And I don't want to see it go under for my sake." Walter pushed the paper back across the table. "That's not what's happening here," he said quietly. "Sit down, Marcus." The boy sat. Walter folded his hands on the table. "I've been watching you for 3 weeks," he said, "and I want you to listen to me carefully, because I don't say things I don't mean." Margaret was very still. "You have a gift," Walter said. "Not just with engines, with figuring out how things work, with seeing what's broken and knowing what it needs. That's not something you learn. That's something you're born with, and then have to be given the room to develop." He paused. "Nobody's given you much room up to now." Marcus didn't say anything. His jaw was tight. "There's a technical college in Nashville with a full scholarship program for youth in the foster system. Margaret called this morning." Marcus looked at Margaret. She nodded. "The application deadline is September 15th, she said. "That gives us time." "I can't pay for any of it," Marcus said, his voice rough. "You're not being asked to," Walter said. "Then what are you asking me for?" Walter looked at him directly. "I'm asking you to go and do what you came into this world to do," he said. "That's all. That's the whole question." There was a silence so full the room could barely hold it. Then Marcus said, the words coming out unsteady, "What about Red?" And Walter said, "Red was never the future of this farm. You are." Marcus left for Nashville on a Friday morning in September. Walter sold Red the following Monday. It covered 3 months, not much more. But 3 months was enough to plant a smaller winter crop, and that crop got them to spring, and spring got them to the next year. Barely, but barely was enough. The years after that were not kind to the Greer farm. Margaret passed in 2003 after a brief illness that moved too fast for anyone to stop. Walter kept going because stopping was not a thing he knew how to do. He downsized. He sold off acreage to cover taxes. By 2010, he was farming half of what he had started with. By 2018, he was farming a third. His neighbors aged or sold or moved on. The farm sat quieter each year. Walter ate his meals at the same kitchen table, looked out the same window, and lived in the particular silence of a man who has given everything he had to something he refuses to abandon. He thought about Marcus sometimes. He did not know if the boy had made it. He did not have a way to find out. He had never asked for anything in return, so there was nothing to trace. Just a name. Marcus Webb. And a memory of a 16-year-old boy sitting on a porch saying he wanted to build something that lasted. In the spring of 2025, Walter received a letter from the bank. He sat at the kitchen table and read it 3 times. Then he folded it carefully. Then he went out to the barn and stood there in the quiet for a very long time. The letter said he had 90 days. 90 days to settle an outstanding debt that had compounded over 2 years of drought and equipment failure and a medical bill from a hospitalization the previous winter that had cost more than he had budgeted for in the remaining years of his life. Walter was 71 years old. He had 43 acres left, a tractor that ran on goodwill and habit, and 90 days. He told no one, not the neighbors, not his brother Raymond, who had moved to Knoxville years ago and called on holidays. He simply went back to work, because it was the only response he had ever known. On a Wednesday morning, 47 days into those 90, Walter was repairing a fence post along the eastern boundary when a black truck he did not recognize turned onto his road. It moved slowly, like the driver was looking for something. It stopped near the barn. A man got out. He was tall, well-dressed. He moved across the yard with the ease of someone who had grown up comfortable, but had never forgotten what discomfort felt like. He stopped about 10 feet from Walter, and he said, "Mr. Greer." Walter looked at him. He looked for a long moment. He saw nothing he recognized at first, and then he saw the eyes, direct, patient, unflinching. "Marcus," Walter said. It came out like something he'd been holding in his chest for a long time. Marcus Webb nodded. He did not speak immediately. He just looked at Walter, the way a man looks at someone who changed the entire direction of his life, when all the words in the English language suddenly feel too small for the moment. "I looked for you," Marcus said finally. "After I graduated, after the business started. I looked for you." "I'm not hard to find," Walter said. "No," Marcus agreed, "but I think I wasn't ready before now. I had to build the thing first, so that when I came back with something real." Walter set down his fencing tool. "What kind of business?" he asked. Marcus told him, "An infrastructure and construction firm, starting from a 2-man welding operation in 2001. Now operating in 7 states, 1,040 employees." Walter listened. He did not react with the shock Marcus might have expected. He just nodded slowly, the way a man nods when something confirms what he always suspected. "You built something that lasts," Walter said. "Yes, sir," Marcus said. "I did." Then Marcus took a folded paper from his jacket pocket. He set it on the fence post between them. Walter looked at it. He did not pick it up. "What is this?" he asked. "The bank letter," Marcus said. "I've been carrying a copy for 6 weeks. A mutual contact in Millbrook told me about it." Walter was very still. "Debt is cleared," Marcus said, "as of Monday." Walter did not say anything. Marcus continued, his voice steady but not quite. "I also want to restore the farm, fully. New equipment, structural repairs, fencing, irrigation, whatever this land needs to run properly for another 30 years. Walter looked out at the field. His jaw moved. He did not speak. "I'm bringing a crew," Marcus said. "I asked some of my best people to volunteer their time. They don't know the whole story. I just told them we were helping someone who needed it." He paused. 50 trucks, Mr. Greer. They come Thursday morning." The silence between them lasted a long time. Then Walter said, his voice lower than usual, "You didn't have to do this." Marcus picked up the paper from the fence post. "You gave me your last bull," he said. "You gave me the scholarship application. You sat on that porch and told me I wasn't a small thing kind of person when I had zero evidence in my entire life to support that." His voice tightened. "You told me to go do what I came into this world to do." He paused. "I'm doing it." Walter turned away for a moment. When he turned back, his eyes were red at the edges. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at Marcus. "Don't you dare make me cry in my own yard," he said. Marcus laughed. And then Walter laughed. And then neither of them was laughing anymore. And they stood there in the morning light of that old farm. 2 men 31 years apart in time, and completely level in that moment. And the weight of everything that a single act of kindness had carried across 3 decades settled quietly into the Tennessee clay beneath their feet. The trucks came Thursday morning, just after sunrise, 50 of them. Neighbors gathered at the fence line. Carol Briggs stood with her arms crossed and her hand pressed against her mouth. Raymond Greer drove up from Knoxville after Walter's call the night before and stood at the edge of the yard, and for the first time in 31 years, he had absolutely nothing to say. Workers poured across the property. Equipment was unloaded. Fences were repaired. Irrigation lines were laid. The old barn got a new roof by mid-afternoon. The tractor that had run on habit and goodwill was assessed, repaired, and quietly replaced with something that could carry a farm forward for another generation. By the time the sun set that evening, the Greer farm looked like something that had decided to survive. Marcus stood beside Walter at the edge of the south field and watched the last of the work lights come on. Walter said, "Margaret would have had every one of those men fed by now." Marcus said, "Tell me about her." And Walter did. 2 months after that Thursday morning, Marcus Webb announced the launch of the Greer Foundation, a scholarship and trade training initiative for youth aging out of foster care across Tennessee, Kentucky, and Georgia. Named for the farm. Named for the man. Funded entirely by Marcus's company. At the press event in Nashville, a reporter asked Marcus where the idea had come from. He thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "A man once told me that he didn't know what he could afford, but he knew what he couldn't live with." He paused. "I've spent 31 years trying to be worthy of that sentence." Walter Greer was sitting in the front row. He was wearing clean boots, and he did not cry. But it was a very close thing. People in Millbrook still talk about the morning those 50 trucks came rolling down the road. Carol Briggs will tell you about it if you give her half a chance. She'll describe the light, the dust behind the convoy, the way the whole county seemed to stop and hold its breath, and she'll always end with the same line. "We thought Walter Greer was finished," she says, "but the truth is, he'd been building toward that morning for 31 years. He just didn't know it yet." There is a version of this story where Walter sold that bull to pay the bill and made the practical choice, and Marcus Webb grew up with nothing to point back to, and the Greer Foundation never existed, and 43 acres of Tennessee farmland quietly disappeared into the ledger of an agricultural bank. That version exists. It is the version that fear would have written. But Walter Greer did not let fear write his story. He chose compassion when compassion was expensive. He invested in a 16-year-old boy when every rational voice around him said he had nothing left to invest. And 31 years later, the return on that investment showed up in 50 trucks and a cleared debt and a foundation that will carry young people forward long after both men are gone. Kindness is never wasted, even when it costs everything, especially then, because the seeds that cost the most are always the ones that grow the tallest. And some harvests take 31 years, but they come. They always come.